Hello, friends. Part 3, which means I hope you watched part 2. If you did not watch part 2, please, please, please go back. Please go back and watch part 2. Uh, for some of you, part 2 may have been your entry point into a history that you really weren't aware of very much. Uh, and That short little video is the tip of an iceberg, an unsettling iceberg. Did part 2 help you see how sin gets inside of our systems and our structures, our building blocks? My hope is that this is opening up a learning journey for you. Jared McKenna asks the question, he says, how can we love our neighbor if we are unwilling to love their neighborhood? And that question really rings true if you just watched part 2. It's the history of the US is very much a history of not loving black neighborhoods. And Christians have been massively complicit in it all. Dr. Nicole Martin, she's the executive director of healing and trauma at the American Bible Society. She says that the way that white people talk about sin in this hyper personal, hyper individual way, she notes that it is a uniquely American thing. And so she says this issue of racism is not about whether you have a friend of a different color or uh, you even like a person of a different color, or whether you even spoke up against racial injustice lately, went to a protest. She says this is about recognizing just what's in the ground in America and recognizing what it is that has connected and separated people for 400 years. And she says for Christians, it comes down to this deep theology of individualism versus community or systems versus individual choices. And she says that's where we have to shake things up. We have to begin to see a both and, not an either or kind of a view. So if you are someone who you tend towards relationships and individualism, individual choices, and I just want everyone to be authentic, it might take some work for you and some courage for you to learn about this history, this systemic history, and say, wow, I have to speak into my sphere of influence about something that isn't personal, but it has affected so many people. Racism isn't something that happened outside of Christianity. I wish that was the case. Racism is something that much of the church in North America was massively complicit in. So there's this historian, Jamar Tisby. He's a committed Christian, and he's written a book and created a 12-part video series, and it's titled The Color of Compromise: The Truth About the American Church's Complicity with Racism. Now, I'm not making you watch the whole 12-part thing before we go on with the video, but I will say that I I want that video to be must watch, the book to be must read kind of material for our church family, for all Christians right now. You if you have Amazon Prime, you can find it as well. Uh, what Jamar does is shows in ugly detail how the white church in North America participated in structures of racism and prejudice for centuries. He tells story after story that will just make you say, oh, make you grimace. And he tells so many stories where white Christians poo-pooed any black Christians who were saying, we are being oppressed. We are being treated unfairly. This is racism. For instance, did you know that in the 1960s, Billy Graham told Martin Luther King that he should put on the brakes on this whole civil rights stuff? And how many Christians follow someone like Billy Graham? So there's so many stories like that. I strongly urge all of you to digest this material. I've bought the video and the book for the church library. I encourage you to check it out. This sin of white supremacy is deep within the building blocks of society and within the congregation for centuries. And far too often, white Christians allowed racism and white supremacy to happen. They were even at the forefront of it sometimes. So I promise you, if you'll take the time to learn the history, it will change you. Now, there are some people who they just struggle to understand, like, why do we need to address something that I didn't personally do? Like, why does this history of sin and systemic sin, why does it matter? In their fabulous book, Evangelical Religion and the Problem of Race in America, Divided by Faith, there's these two guys, Emerson and Smith, and what they really come down to is saying there's a need on these racial issues within the church for forgiveness, confession, forgiveness, and education. And they put the question this way. They say, okay, so if Moses and Ezra and Job and Nehemiah and Daniel and Stephen all identified with the sins of their forefathers, shouldn't we? That's the way they put the question. If the sin embedded within the building blocks of the society that we live in is white supremacy and racism, then why wouldn't we name it? Concerns for justice have never been optional. They've never been extracurricular for Christians. The Bible has literally thousands of verses that show us God's heart for the poor and the foreigner and the orphan and the widow and the oppressed. Racial reconciliation is embedded within the heart of the gospel. That's Ephesians 2. The church is meant to embody the one new humanity, the reconciled community. Going back to the Exodus story, so the people of Israel, they suffered oppression and slavery in Egypt for over 400 years before things built up to a tipping point. Remember part one. And God heard the people's groaning. God was deeply concerned for the people. You see, Egypt had bought into a system of oppression, and God was on the side of the oppressed. But it wasn't only the Israelite people who were oppressed in Egypt. There were many others. Sociologist and scholar Gerhard Linsky, his work shows that in Egypt, at the time of the Exodus, all the power and wealth was in, he says, the top 2%. So there's all your power and wealth. He says about 5 to 6% were merchants, but he says all of the rest of the people, not just the Israelites, were in abject poverty. They were oppressed. They were in slavery. So the Exodus. So when God led the people out of Egypt in the Exodus, we're told, Exodus 12:38, many other people went up with them, and also droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. So these people coming out of Egypt, Israel, they were no longer an ethnically bound group. In a very real sense, that event, the Exodus, likely changed the skin color of the Israelite people because everyone else who was under oppression, they left with the Israelites and they became a part of that group. More important than the skin color, we're told that the Canaanite empires trembled. They heard what had happened in Egypt. Why? Because the same kind of oppression characterized their systems, their structures, their empires. And we could see God was breaking up those systems of oppression. All right, we got to get clear on Romans 13. Anytime a conversation comes up about the police, there are Christians who like to quote Romans 13, 1 through 7. The key verse there is, if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. And the text is taken out of context by many people to they say it's basically saying, well, God chooses our rulers and only the bad people get punished. End of story. However, Romans 13 is sandwiched between Romans 12, 9 through 21. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If your enemy is thirsty, give him something to drink. And on the other side, you've got Romans 13, 8 through 10. Love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. And so the Apostle Paul, in that chunk of Romans, he's providing a contrast between believers who love their enemies and empires who rule with the sword. So anyone who wants to use Romans 13 to justify the actions of the police has to understand some basic historical context, which is the governing authorities in view in Romans 13, 1 through 7. Those folks were never Christians. Never. So the Apostle Paul says in that same chunk, he says, there's no authority except that which God has ordered. And it becomes real tricky for people. Like, what are we to make of that text in light of dictators like Hitler, Stalin, Osama bin Laden, Kim Jong un, Pol Pot, Mussolini? Did God choose them? Theologian John Howard Yoder offers a helpful insight here on this particular text, Romans 13. He writes, God is not said to create or ordain the powers that be, but only to order them, to put them in order, sovereignly to tell them where they belong, what is their place. It is not as if there was a time when there was no government and then God made government through a new creative intervention. The librarian does not create or approve of the books she or he catalogs and shelves. Likewise, God does not take responsibility for the existence of the rebellious powers that be, or for their shape or identity. They already are. What the text says is that God orders them, brings them into line, providentially and permissively lines them up with divine purposes. And even more important is the fact that the long biblical story that we have of kings comes from a story where God wanted to be our only king. And 1 Samuel 8, when God finally says, very well, have it your way, you can have a king, kings were only an accommodation ever for the people of the kingdom of God. And so, as we look at the world today, the kingdom of God is not banking on any king or any president to be the answer to everything, to make everything better. We're banking on King Jesus, our allegiance to King Jesus. Move upriver. At a simple level, it seems unbelievable the amount of tension and violence and disagreement that has happened over this simple message. Black Lives Matter. Of course they do. It's unbelievable that that message would cause such an eruption. But there's a whole lot more going on. On the other hand, not everyone is comfortable with everything that the Black Lives Matter movement is asking for, demanding, such as defunding police departments. And this is where the political and the economic interests of the day call for the congregation to align themselves with one side or the other side. Do you stand with Black Lives Matter or with the police? Remember what we learned in part one about denial? In denial, we attempt to reframe other people's experience according to our terms, and we ask hurting people to adapt to us, like they should have to make the changes, not us. Now, you may not agree with every solution that the Black Lives Matter movement is asking for. And I'm not claiming to know what all of the solutions are. I don't. But I want to say this, and I believe this deeply. If the solutions do not come from the leading Black voices of the Black community, the solutions will simply be new ways of the dominant white society asking or forcing the Black community to adapt. It's denial. So, with that said, I want to voice a note of compassion for police departments, for people in police service. I want to voice a note of care for the predicament that our society has created for them in their work. There are many societal structures that have been defunded at some level already. Mental health, psychiatric units have been exchanged, some people say, even for prisons. Addiction treatment and education has been defunded in many ways. The war on drugs has focused way more on the supply than the demand. So many parents have been incarcerated. And so it creates this kind of impossible scenario for police because they're going into a situation every day that has been years in the making. And now they're put at risk and they are forced to intervene in a myriad of situations that were created by society. And so the police force, it's like they've spent years seeing people's lives thrown into the river to drown, as it were. And now they get called in to save these people, and they have to make split second decisions and bind up the wounds. And it's not to say that police brutality doesn't happen, racism, prejudice, implicit bias, all those things are real. We've seen it, we know it, it happens. But this scenario that police have been put into is akin to uh, asking them to put band-aids on all these drowning people and throw them life preservers At what point do you stop throwing life preservers and putting on band-aids? And at what point do you start asking, wait a minute, who's beating up all these people and throwing them in the river? Like, why is all of this happening? And at what point do you move up river? What if the message of the congregation to the crowd within this world was saying not just you all need to move up the river, but saying we will move up the river. Uh, we will show you and what self-sacrificial love looks like, to lay down privilege, to be willing to do what is needed, to model to the crowd what it looks like to own the sin of white supremacy, complicity in racism, to lament over that, to reconcile, to listen, to learn, to collaborate, to love in self-sacrificial ways. What if the congregation leaned into that? Would that give us sure footing as the waves of culture clash? So this question, it's the Galatians question that we started with. Are we as the congregation going to draw back from what's happening in our world right now with the racial tension? Or will we lean in and will we live in line with the truth of the gospel? Will we become together the reconciled community as we follow Jesus? So that's it, friends. I hope you'll chew on this for a long time, the rest of your life. Love you.